Hello and welcome to this edition of Grants World. Our keynote speaker is Joan Waugh discussing the topic of grant and reconstruction. We will also have a segment on the Grant Presidential Library Archives, and you will also hear from our executive director and where we will be headed for the next year's annual USGA meeting. But first, I wanted to give you the perfect seat for our annual meeting just completed in St. Louis, Missouri, as I go over some of the highlights. First, I want to thank everyone involved, including John Sampson, the chair for the 2024 annual meeting. Also to USGA member Karen Maxwell for their year-long planning for this event. And a thank you to those from Grants Farm and the Bush family for providing special access to the property and to hardscrabble. And to those from the Grant National Historical Site and the National Park Service. This year was special as we added 2 extra days of activities, making it a total of 4 days with 2 full days to travel and sightsee through St. Louis. On Thursday evening, our first night, we gathered for a meet and greet with remarks from Ann and myself. On Friday, we traveled to Grant's Farm and took a tram for our first stop at Hardscrabble, built by Grant and lived in for a few months between 1856 and 1857. We toured the home, which is seldom open to the public. The National Park Service staff led the memorable tour. Even lunch was entertaining as we enjoyed a catered meal inside the farm's historic carriage house. There was even a trivia contest testing everyone's knowledge of Grant. And I'm not going to tell you how I did. After lunch, we walked over to the Ulysses S. Grant National Historical Site, Whitehaven, where Grant first met Julia. Here we divided into 3 groups to tour Whitehaven, toured their historic museum full of Grant artifacts and information. The third tour was an excellent living history performance by Greg Carr, who portrayed William Jones, the enslaved African-American owned and later freed by Grant. For dinner that night, we heard from Nick Sacco, the historian curator for the Grant Historical Site. He discussed Grant in St. Louis, which was most informative, with carefully chosen pictures to complement his topic. On Saturday, we toured Jefferson Barracks, including the Missouri Civil War Museum. We went through Jefferson Barracks Museum and toured the grounds and the 19th century buildings. Later, we toured the Campbell House. The mansion was built in 1851 by Campbell, whom Grant became friends with after the Civil War. It was thought-provoking knowing Grant and Julia had visited the Campbells several times and to see the dinner table where they would have eaten. Lunch was by culinary historian Suzanne Corbett, who specializes in 19th century cuisine and prepared a meal that was popular during Grant's time. We next went to the Gateway Arch National Park, where member Pam Sanfilippo, the program manager for museum services, gave a presentation. Afterward, Lynn Jackson, a direct descendant of Dred Scott, gave a talk about slavery and reconciliation. At dinner that night, John Sampson was awarded the John Y. Simon Award of Merit for his contributions to the Grant Association. It was my honor to present it. At dinner that night, board member and author Harold Holzer discussed Grant, Lincoln, and the uncivil war over imagination. It was most interesting and informative. On Sunday, we had our board meeting, followed by the general members meeting. If these annual meetings sound interesting to you, and they sure seem that way to me, please join us next year on May 1st through the 4th, when we will be going to Jackson, Mississippi. The highlight, of course, will be a tour of Vicksburg and the surrounding area, as well as the historical sites in Jackson. Our member, Brother Rogers of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, is chairing the committee. Stay in touch for the details. So that's it from here. Please enjoy this issue of Grant's World.
Greetings from the Grant Presidential Library. We are recuperating here from a very busy annual meeting a couple of weeks ago in St. Louis, and we had a wonderful time. It was amazing, and it was so much fun to go see the wonderful Grant sites in the St. Louis area and to spend a lot of time with people who love Ulysses S. Grant for a few days, and it was just the best time. And so we're looking forward to next year's meeting. So I want to tell everyone to go ahead and save the date. We'll be having our meeting next year a little closer to home, or at least to our home here in Mississippi. We will be based in Jackson next year and also be taking a day trip over to Vicksburg to see Vicksburg, as well as some of the sites of Grant's other battles in Mississippi during the Vicksburg campaign. So be sure to mark your calendars for May 1st through 4th, 2025, so that you can come join us for that excursion. Well, today I'd like to also share with you one of the most interesting and actually oldest items in our collection that's related to Ulysses S. Grant. And that is the top portion of a doctor's ledger in which he has written an entry where he has billed Jesse Root Grant, Ulysses' father, for a dental extraction on Ulysses. This is dated from 1837. Making Grant only 15 years old when he would have had his teeth pulled. And I guess that's 19th century dental care for you. There was no fluoride back then. Many of you may be familiar with the story about how Grant lost a pair of dentures while he was aboard a ship during the Vicksburg campaign. He had put them in a wash basin to soak overnight, and his attendant threw them overboard with the dirty water, and that left Grant without any teeth for about a month, making what was already a campaign full of hardships even worse. So we are really excited about this ledger piece, and it's really interesting to think about the fact that when this lowly physician in Georgetown, Ohio, made this entry for this 15-year-old boy, he had no idea that he had just pulled the tooth of a future president. And this is just one of the many amazing items that we have in our archive here at the Presidential Library, and we look forward to continuing to share these items with you virtually through these newsletters, but we also would love to share them with you in person. So please think about coming to visit us here in Starkville.
Hello and welcome to the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. My name is Ryan Sims. I'm the archivist here with the Grant Library, and today we're going to show you a little bit about our storage facility. Our storage facility is a climate-controlled facility where we keep not only all of our artwork and artifacts, but our original manuscripts and our massive book collection as well. We have a number of pieces of art, framed materials that are hanging in our art storage facility, and you can see down both of these rows, we not only keep the materials from the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library collection, but as well as the Frank and Virginia Williams collection of Lincolniana in this space. So you'll see a lot of pictures, paintings, original prints and engravings, and certificates and political cartoons and all sorts of things hanging in this area. And these are the materials that we use and will swap out in our galleries. So as we head up the ramp and go to the top level, you'll see that we have a number of mechanical shelving or compact shelving. This is where we keep not only the Grant book collection, but where we keep the papers of the Ulysses S. Grant Association, all of our family artifacts, as well as a number of other collections housed here at the Mississippi State Libraries at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. Within this compact shelving, you'll notice that we have a number of materials that are oddly shaped. This is the best place for us to house those as well. Now, up around the perimeter of the compact shelving, we have the Frank and Virginia Williams collection of Lincolniana book collection. This collection is separated into two collections, books entirely and only about Abraham Lincoln, and then books that we call Civil War collateral that are about the Civil War era. These two book collections make up nearly 15,000 volumes of books on Abraham Lincoln and his time. Add to that nearly 13,000 volumes in the Grant Presidential Library book collection, and we have nearly 30,000 volumes related to the Civil War era. And they're available for people to use within our reading room in our library by appointment only. These are a special collection, so they cannot be checked out. Now, the Papers of Ulysses S. Grant is an editorial project that we have been working on since 1962. And what we have here is hundreds and hundreds of drawers containing files that have a copy of every known letter written by Ulysses S. Grant, every letter written to Ulysses S. Grant, and also correspondence to and from people who knew Grant and served under him or served with him as president. So if you come to the Grant Presidential Library to do research, we'll be able to pull materials from this collection, which is all arranged chronologically, and you'll be able to utilize research copies of original documents housed in archives, libraries, and private collections from all around the world. So thank you for joining me on this short trip through our storage facility here at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. We hope that you'll come and visit our museum and gallery spaces, and we also hope you'll come here and conduct research with us utilizing our wonderful collections.
Our keynote speaker for this program is Joan Waugh. She's a professor from the UCLA History Department and researches and writes about 19th century America, specializing in the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age eras. Waugh has published many essays and books on Civil War topics, including U.S. Grant, American Hero, American Myth. Also, The American War, A History of the Civil War Era. Other books include Unsentimental Reformer, The Life of Josephine Shaw Lowell, The Memory of the Civil War in American Culture, and Wars Within a War, Controversy and Conflict over the American Civil War. She's the president of the Society of Civil War Historians from 2020 to 22. Joan is often invited to give public lectures about the Civil War. She has been interviewed for several documentaries, including the PBS series American Experience, Ulysses S. Grant, and the History Channel production of Lee and Grant. In addition to seminars, Dr. Waugh teaches the Civil War and Reconstruction and Gilded Age America 1865 to 1900 lecture courses and has been honored with 3 teaching prizes, including UCLA's prestigious Distinguished Teaching Award. She was appointed at Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar from 2021 to 23. Waugh's current projects include an exploration of the nature of U.S. Grant's surrender policy during the Civil War. Joan?
Thank you, Jim, for inviting me to talk to Grant's World on Grant and Reconstruction. 1868 featured an historic presidential campaign election fought over the issues of the Civil War and its aftermath, Reconstruction, and it was the first one to be held after Lincoln's assassination and President Andrew Johnson's impeachment proceedings. Inauguration Day on March 4, 1869, dawned cold and windy. Thousands shivered in front of the Capitol as they waited anxiously for the newly elected president's speech. The 46-year-old, the youngest man to be elected so far in U.S. history, Ulysses S. Grant, gave a short but pointed inaugural address emphasizing the necessity to promote sectional harmony. Grant concluded, quote, I ask patient forbearance towards another throughout the land and a determined effort on the part of every citizen to do his share towards cementing a happy union. Unknown to Grant, his words increasingly fell on deaf ears, and the happy union or reunion envisioned was much harder to achieve than thought. During Grant's first and second term as well, dramatic changes in the economy, reshaping both factories and farms, held far-reaching implications for American society. Immigration, urbanization, and industrialization brought new challenges and new headaches, requiring new responses. But no issue commanded Grant's attention like Reconstruction, and no issue affected his presidency, his reputation, and his legacy more profoundly. It was the reason he sought the office, and he was deeply involved in the implementation of policy, even though other areas of his administration also commanded his attention. The goals of Reconstruction to restore harmonious relations between the sections and to define and secure freedom for the ex-slaves were difficult. As Grant's term began, it was already clear that many in the northern white loyal citizens, both Republicans but also some Democrats, supported emancipation, but were not really ready to commit to full political and social equality for freed people. Obviously, the ongoing Reconstruction would be a huge job for any president that not only involved readmitting the seceded states with their bitter, defeated, impoverished white population, but also reinventing a South without slavery and rebuilding the Southern infrastructure that had been destroyed by the war. It would encompass military, constitutional, legal, economic, and emotional issues. Additionally, the divisions in the North deepened between those that favored a lenient policy toward the region and those that advocated more punitive measures. Grant possessed a belief embraced by Abraham Lincoln and the triumphant Republican Party that won the war, freed 4 million enslaved people, and ensured the continuation of the American Republic. And here's the belief. The old United States was destroyed, replaced with a non-slaveholding republic. The freedoms promised by that new republic, embodied in the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, had to be protected, surely at first, by a strong federal power in peacetime. An added benefit would be to cement the Republicans as a national party in all sections of the country. Reconstruction was bound to be controversial and difficult to implement. President Grant pledged to use that power, and when he did, resistance was fierce, especially when that power was used to protect freed people and advance their right as citizens. Would the country and its president be up to what was a pretty impossible task? The title of my talk today is simple and to the point, and here is what I'm going to do with Grant and Reconstruction. First of all, I'll look briefly at the historical reputation Grant enjoyed or did not as a Reconstruction president. Then I'll give a brief look and review of the first two Reconstruction presidents and Grant's response to Lincoln and Johnson's Reconstruction policies. I will proceed then to the main part of my talk, President Grant's Reconstruction from 1868 to 1876, concluding with an evaluation. For much of the 20th century, Grant's historical reputation as the third president to serve in the Reconstruction era was judged a failure. The popular stereotype of President Ulysses S. Grant as a political dimwit, watching helplessly as his administration became awash in corruption and chicanery, has deep roots in the past. Indeed, few figures in American history have been so denigrated and disgraced as Grant and the Reconstruction period. A big part of the answer can be found in the successful campaign by historians sympathetic to the Confederacy's lost cause. Many portrayed Grant as a drunken butcher general and as an enfeebled president who pandered to radical Republicans, presiding over, as one contended, quote, the darkest page in the saga of American history. In the standard histories of the period, Reconstruction was portrayed as a harsh and corrupt rule imposed on helpless white Southerners by a combination of vindictive radical Republicans, ignorant African Americans, evil carpetbaggers, Northerners who went south, and turncoat scalawags, pro-Northern Southerners. Reconstruction made by Grant's Republican was an utter dismal failure. These distortions still thrive in some history textbook and classrooms and in various different media outlets. However, from the 1960s onward, after the turmoil of the second civil rights protest movements, scholars trained in social and race history rejected the largely racist interpretation and recast the story of Reconstruction much more favorably, making Black civil rights and the struggle for freedom at the center of the tale, where it remains to this day. One part of the story remained the same until very recently, did not change in at least the early historiography, beginning in the 50s and 60s and accelerating through the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. But one part of the story remained a part of the story. Grant's presidency was still deemed a failure, and his presidency and his actions, inadequate actions, simply reflected the deep racism of Northern society. And his presidential reputation remained mired at the bottom of the presidential rankings. My own question from my study of Grant when I came to this part of his career was how to assess him. And one answer for me was to stop separating the Civil War from the Reconstruction. A better way to look at Grant and to judge him is not to treat his military and political career as separate, but to approach them as an integrated experience, to emphasize, to perceive, to analyze the continuities in his life as a general and as a president, and with the soldier-statesman angle emphasized. The real question should be, how can we assess the overall development of Grant's judgment and powers of leadership under the extreme pressure that he was under from 1861 to 1865 in terms of how he approached the political side of his career from 1865 to 1876? Fortunately, recent scholarship has answered this question. I would agree with them, those kinds of texts and histories and narratives that have replaced the stereotypical image of Grant with a richer, more complicated portrait, one in which he emerges as what we can call an essential president who should go down in history as an important champion of civil rights and a president who kept the country together during the Reconstruction crisis. In war, Ulysses S. Grant's conviction that the Union was going to be preserved is what guided and sustained his military policy. In the war, he came to develop a broad national perspective on the means as well as the end of rebellion. As general, he not only planned and executed military campaigns, but also presided over the occupation of the southern population and territory. He formulated and implemented policies and practices that not only predicted Reconstruction, but actually was Reconstruction, wartime Reconstruction. This experience prepared him for the office of the president, and in this regard, he took his cue from President Abraham Lincoln, the first Reconstruction president. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, comprised the first stage of Reconstruction, which was followed almost a year later by his, quote, Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction that was issued on December 8th, 1863. Under its generous terms, which were grounded in the president's constitutional power to, quote, grant reprieves and pardons, Lincoln hoped to speed the restoration of the Union. The strong opposition from many Republicans prevented the implementation of his program. President Lincoln's last remarks on Reconstruction, given on April 11th, 1865, just 4 days before John Wilkes Booth shot him, Lincoln gave a brief speech in which he said he would consider the vote for African American veterans and a few other Black men. Sadly, we can only surmise what his eventual program for Reconstruction would have entailed. After Lincoln's assassination, Grant remained a powerful presence in the country, officially serving as General-in-Chief overseeing the military part of Reconstruction policy for President Andrew Johnson, the second Reconstruction president. Johnson of Tennessee opposed secession, remaining loyal to the United States. He was appointed military governor of the state, and during his tenure repeatedly called for the end of slavery. He was added to the 1864 Union ticket, not Republican, but Union ticket, as vice president as a way to appeal to what Republicans hoped going forward would be a larger base of the party, including a significant number of Southerners, if they could get them. At first, Grant thought he could work with President Andrew Johnson. He felt that he had an immense investment in helping to establish a permanent and solid peace between North and South. To this end, however, Grant would be seriously hampered by the rapid demobilization of the huge Civil War army of 1 million, largely made up of volunteers. Why would he be hampered by that, even if Johnson wasn't the president? Any successful occupation and thus control of the vast region of the former Confederate States would have required a large standing army. Throughout Reconstruction, congressional Republicans, and this was especially important to note that they included radical Republicans and most moderate Republicans, were on board for reducing the regular peacetime army at regular intervals. This is the standing army. So there, in other words, from roughly 54,000 in 1866 to 37,000 in 1869 to 27,000 in 1876, remained under about 25,000 to the end of the century. So this was a problem for a strong Northern Reconstruction program, as it turned out. But nevertheless, back to the second Reconstruction president, Grant watched with growing horror the high-stakes controversy between Congress and the executive branch over Andrew Johnson's so-called easy Reconstruction program for Reconstruction, in which the readmitted ex-Confederate states acted in ways that most Northerners, a majority of Northerners at this time, believed violated the spirit of surrender. For example, Johnson's overly generous amnesty proclamation led to too many pardons too quickly for ex-Confederates, led to the establishment of black codes restricting black life and movement, to riots over the South, especially in Mississippi and in other areas. So there was a real hostility growing, a division growing between Johnson and the Republicans. In short, Johnson seemed to be opposed to every program that the Republicans backed, and especially bothered the radicals, Charles Sumner and company. On the other side, an increasingly radicalized Republican Party believed not just in recasting the South in the free labor style, but also establishing a Southern party with the support and votes of freedmen, the largest loyal group in the South. And this made sense to Grant as a method to secure the fruits of Appomattox and the sacrifices of Union soldiers to maintain the Republic. Grant believed that Johnson was acting irresponsibly and in doing so, placing the Union victory at risk. The fall elections of 1866 supplied the radical Republicans with a mandate to pursue their problem. The great political drama that ended with Johnson's impeachment trial in early 1868 intensified when Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, casting out Johnson's Reconstruction governments and bringing Grant new responsibilities. The acts themselves divided the 10 unreconstructed southern states into 5 military districts with commanders appointed to oversee the establishment and administration of the new states back into the Union. These district commanders would report directly to General Grant, deliberately bypassing the president. Thus, Grant held the authority over Johnson for overseeing the return to the fold of ex-Confederate states to the Union. Under his leadership, conventions drafted new laws and wrote new state constitutions. In his hands rested the ultimate responsibility for enforcing the 13th and 14th Amendments. Grant's political position was solidified by his appointment of Secretary of War ad interim, a position he held from August 12, 1867 to January 13, 1868. 5 months he was at the center of power. He held the post of Secretary of War to protect Edwin Stanton, of course, and Grant kept his position as General-in-Chief. He was his own boss. And this period proved vitally important to Grant's political maturation. During this time, he enacted and guided political policies designed to cement and advance wartime goals. The key here is that Grant was demonstrating to the country his understanding that the issues of the Civil War would continue to impact the public policy of the country for years to come. This experience that I've just outlined is the reason why Grant was the only choice for the 1868 presidential election for the Republicans. And General-in-Chief U.S. Grant was at his office in the War Department when notification of his nomination as the Republican Party's presidential candidate arrived in May of 1868. He wrote a brief but heartfelt letter of acceptance endorsing the party platform. Reaching for harmony, Grant concluded his missive with the proclamation, "Let us have peace," which became the slogan of the Republican campaign. It meant, let us have peace. It meant peace between black and white, between parties, peace between North and South. Like President Lincoln, Grant was both an ardent reconciliationist and a supporter of civil rights for the freed people and suffrage for black men. So although other issues were at play, most citizens viewed the 1868 presidential contest between Grant and New York's former Governor Horatio Seymour as a referendum on Republican Reconstruction. Grant won the election of 1868 with a comfortable margin, 53% of the popular vote, 214 to 80 in the electoral, but only with black participation, even though those voters faced intimidation and violence in many ex-Confederate states. Indeed, the black vote was crucial to the triumph of the Grant ticket in November and also to the continuance of the Republican vision of Reconstruction. During the campaign, the 14th Amendment was ratified, campaign of 1868, and the 15th Amendment went to the states. In 1869, as Grant began his first term, he expressed optimism that blacks could gain a solid footing in the South with time and with good faith on the part of whites. Quote, "The freedmen," he said, "under the protection which they have received, are making rapid progress in learning, and no complaints are heard about lack of industry on their part, where they receive fair remuneration for their labor." With Grant's election, congressional Republicans believed they had a solid friend in the White House, working to ensure their goals of Reconstruction, and that those goals would prevail. Reconciliation with whites, a free labor society in the South, protection and civil rights guaranteed for its freed people, and a competitive two-party system. This was the Republicans' great chance to establish themselves in the South and be a national party, which they weren't at this point. So the There were problems looming in the future, although you wouldn't necessarily see it in 1868 or 1869. One thing is that it seems that a lot of voters in the North were finished or seemed finished with Reconstruction, and Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but they couldn't get them passed in the states without lots of arm twisting. And at least half of the Northerners did not like the 14th and 15th Amendments. Let's get back to Grant's early days in office. When he assumed office in 1869, the majority of ex-Confederate states had Reconstruction governments in place, thanks to black votes and restrictions on white suffrage, ensuring a very fragile Republican presence. The establishment of the so-called black Republican governments met with immediate opposition from violent white supremacists working to overthrow these governments and reinstitute the Democratic Party. Grant immediately took action. Following the expulsion of black legislatures in Georgia, the president asked that the state be temporarily returned to military rule. This one action provided a huge boost in the efforts to ratify the 15th Amendment, which Grant signed off on, declaring that, quote, a measure which makes at once for millions of people voters who were heretofore declared by the highest tribunal in the land not citizens of the United States, nor eligible to become so, is indeed a measure of grander importance than any other one act of the kind from the foundation of our free government to the present day, end of quote. And to those he knew would oppose the measure, Grant cautioned, quote, to the race more favored heretofore by our laws, I would say, withhold no legal privilege of advancement to the new citizen, end of quote. The final version of the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right to vote to all males, quote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and included an enforcement clause. Suffrage discrimination based on gender, education, immigrant status, and residence was not specifically prohibited. Still, the passage of the 15th represented another huge advancement for Black Americans that, like emancipation, was unimaginable only a short while ago. In addition, right after the 15th Amendment was passed, Grant signed the first Enforcement Act to protect the right of Black suffrage. He also signed a bill creating the Department of Justice under the Attorney General. What was happening here was that the federal government was consolidating power to enforce the civil rights of freed people. And here we have to acknowledge again something important about Northern white Americans. Attitudes in the North regarding Black enfranchisement illuminates the absence of urgency regarding extending the vote for Black men. In 1865, only 5 northern states, all in New England, made it possible for Black men to vote. That year, efforts to give the vote to Black men failed, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Connecticut. Over the next 3 years, similar referenda failed in New York, Ohio, Kansas, and the Nebraska Territory. It seemed again as if many in the former Union states had concluded that the war was over. But let's go on with Grant and Reconstruction. And here's news you can use. Under Reconstruction, the expansion of the political nation to include Black men did become a reality. In the decade plus 2 years that followed the surrender, freedmen joined political organizations, voted in great numbers, and were elected to all levels of government throughout the South. South Carolina and Louisiana, for example, had a majority of African American legislatures, and 16 African Americans were elected to the U.S. Congress. A sizable number of Black office holders were competent and intelligent men, and the biracial Republican state governments instituted many positive changes, including introducing public school education for both Black and white students and encouraging business investment in the region. In prosperous and depressed times, the South, white and Black alike, suffered from poverty and limited opportunity throughout the Reconstruction period and well beyond it. The freed people, however, aspired to own their own plot of land. Instead, they had to settle for sharecropping, a labor arrangement which favored the cotton planters. If Republicans were to stand a chance in the South, they would also need the support of Southern whites. Here's more news you can use. Southern Republicans were in power, facing momentous challenges in office. For many reasons, internal divisions instead of unity prevailed, and thus seriously weakened the state governments, and providing the resurgent Southern Democrats with popular issues running against high taxes and, yes, corruption. But by far the most potent issue was Black suffrage and the presumed racial equality that it bestowed. Republican power in the South, sustained by African American votes, had to be smashed and Blacks returned to a subordinate position. Ku Klux Klan inspired voter intimidation, numerous political murders, and widespread terror paralyzed Republican governments in Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and North and South Carolina in the late 1860s and early 1870s. Beleaguered state and local officials pleaded with the federal government for assistance in maintaining order. Grant responded. He signed into law 3 measures known as the Force Acts of 1870 to 1871. These enabled the president to use the power of the federal government to restore order by sending troops, imposing martial law, and suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The point was to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment. For example, Grant suspended the writ of habeas corpus in 9 South Carolina counties, which was one of the boldest demonstrations of presidential power in America's peacetime history. Grant wielded his power by using federal marshals and military forces to arrest thousands of Klansmen in several states. Although only 65 Klansmen actually went to federal prison, the specter of vigorous federal presence in elections made the subsequent 1872 presidential elections the fairest and the freest in the South until late in the 20th century. However, the Force Acts were widely unpopular in the North, not only the South, and they had a negative impact on the fate of Reconstruction. The actions taken under the laws, however justified to people living in the 21st century, violated cherished belief in the separation of powers and handed the Democrats an issue that they never lost hold of for the rest of Grant's presidential career: Caesarism. In other words, imposing a military dictatorship and crushing the right of states to run their own affairs. Grant in vain pleaded with ex-Confederates to, quote, treat the Negro as a citizen and as a voter, as he is and must remain, and soon parties will be divided not on the color line, but on principle. Then we will have a union, he continued, not calling for interference in any one section that would not be exercised in like circumstances in any other. Just before the upcoming 1872 election, Grant signed the Amnesty Act just before the election, which restored civil rights to all Southerners except a handful of top Confederate leaders. So in this way, Grant was fulfilling a goal of bringing disaffected white Southerners back into the Union and give them voting rights again. So he was doing two things at once and supported by most Republicans. However, Democrat voters overwhelmingly rejected the rationale of intervention. But it was also offensive to a small but increasingly influential number of Republicans who formed themselves into a dissident wing of the party. They were called the Liberal Republicans. Grant agreed to seek a second term in 1872 because he felt his work was still unfinished. This election, like the one in 1868, was over Reconstruction. Grant was still hugely popular with Northern voters, and he also commanded the support of former abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who stated, "Whatsoever may be the fault of the Republican Party, it has within it the only element of friendship for the colored man's rights." The Liberal Republicans nominated New York Tribune owner and editor Horace Greeley for their candidate, also receiving the Democratic Convention's endorsement as well. Greeley demanded a new departure for the country in which the home rule for the South would be instituted. Election results in 1872 validated Grant, who easily defeated Greeley by a popular landslide of 56 to 44%. 600,000 more votes than in 1868, and an even larger electoral majority of 286 to 66. His coattails were long, with Republicans winning a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. Grant hoped that his second term could make progress on the thorny issues still threatening the country. "I do now," he claimed, "as I did 4 years ago, sincerely believe that the interests of the whole country demand the success of the Republican Party." Grant's hopes and goals for a second administration were smashed in the so-called Panic of 1873, followed by a severe depression. As if the perilous economy wasn't bad enough, the exposure of top administration officials in scandals such as the infamous whiskey ring, obliterated much of the good feeling created by his 1872 victory. Depression, corruption, and continued white resistance in the South prompted disaffection and apathy in the North, spelled trouble for the upcoming elections. In short, at this time, the Southern Republican coalition was coming apart under the relentless pressure from white Democrats who railed against Black republicanism and fought against Negro rule. Replacing the Ku Klux Klan, other terrorist organizations sprang up to commit acts of violence against African Americans, office holders, Republican politicians, and voters. Louisiana's crisis reached epic proportions, providing a case study as to why Reconstruction failed. Both Democrat and Republican governments claimed victory in the 1872 state elections. The disputed results were decided in favor of Louisiana Republicans, but the appearance of the White League paramilitary group made governing impossible. The White League was implicated in 2 shocking massacres of blacks at Colfax in 1873 and Coshada in 1874. Elections held in 1874 were again disputed. Federal troops were sent to arrest several Democratic members of the legislature and to restore order. With chaos deepening, Grant authorized the sending of 5,000 soldiers to crush the rebellion. Calm temporarily prevailed, but popular revulsion over the extent of Northern interference with Louisiana and other ex-Confederate states had reached a boiling point. This revulsion boded ill for the Republican fortunes of political fortunes of the Republican Party. The perception that Southern Republicans could not win elections except at the point of a gun guaranteed the reemergence of the Democrats. White Southerners, quote unquote, redeemed their state governments one by one, and when they did, African Americans were removed from office and denied their newfound voice in politics. By 1876, only 3 Republican governments remained in the South: Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, all sustained by military power, but not for much longer. The election of 1876 can be seen as a final chapter of Reconstruction and certainly Grant's closing act. The nation held its breath as to whether the 19th President of the United States would be Republican and former Union General Rutherford B. Hayes, or New York's Democrat Samuel B. Tilden. The electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon were claimed by both parties. By the way, the Republicans did retain their comfortable majority in the Senate and surprisingly gained back many of the seats in the House that they lost in 1874, although Democrats retained their slender majority. Grant performed his role in this point as a mediator with dignity and tried to assume an air of careful neutrality, although the specially appointed Electoral Commission had 8 Republicans to 7 Democrats. And the votes were cast along strict party lines. In the midst of uncertainty, Grant assuaged worries that he would use the Army to ensure the election victory for Democrats. The victor was Rutherford B. Hayes, who officially ended Reconstruction when he pulled the Army out of the South. By April of 1877, redemption was complete, and all the states of the former Confederacy were again under Democratic rule. In his final address to the nation, Grant uttered an extraordinary but also refreshingly candid apology. I can't imagine any of our recent presidents doing this. Quote, "It was my fortune or misfortune to be called to the office of chief executive without any previous political training. Under such circumstances," he recalled, "it is but reasonable to suppose that errors of judgment must have occurred. Mistakes have been made, as all can see, and I admit." Grant insisted, though, "I have acted in every instance from a conscientious desire to do what was right. Failures have been errors of judgment, not of intent." End of quote. Perhaps as this part of my talk concludes, you may wonder why Grant's presidential reputation is changing to a more positive assessment and has been changing since the 1990s. Let me try and put it in perspective. The revisionist Grant is not, of which I count myself as one, is not a politically naive fumbler who allowed his cronies to lead him around by the nose. Rather, he was sensitive to political concerns and passionately committed to pursuing the goals of the war, reunion and emancipation, securing emancipation. The new Grant remained a powerful symbol of the justice of the Union cause in his 8 years of office as president. Throughout his administration, Grant labored diligently for both sectional harmony and the guarantee of the freed people's newly gained political and economic freedoms. One prominent historian declared, quote, "For his steadfastness over Reconstruction and more, Grant, long an object of derision, deserves to be honored as a major American leader, one of the best presidents of his day, if not in all of American history." In fact, studying Grant's campaign against the Klan and other actions, historians now find far more commitment to African Americans than his people in the North were willing to give. Grant's final task as president harked back to his first and perhaps the most important achievement, to ensure a stable transition, this time in the disputed election of 1876. Like Lincoln, His fight was over the future of the Union. Only this time the issues were not secession and slavery, but what kind of nation would emerge at the dawn of the 20th century. He succeeded, and the country imperfectly, it must be said, reconciled for good. Few, if any, professional politicians could have done better, and most might have done far worse. Grant's legacy to his own generation was deep and wide. I have argued that by the time of his death on July 23, 1885, at Mount McGregor, New York, Ulysses S. Grant was an icon in the historical memory of the war, shared by a whole generation of men and women. They believed that an appreciation of Grant would only come with the recognition that he was both the heroic general that saved the Union and the stalwart president who made sure it stayed together. Thank you.